Thanks so much for making time to learn more about grant writing and resource identification. Today, we're going to explore a couple different approaches to securing resources: asset based community development and grant writing. We're going to reflect on what we need: time, money, people, space, or something else entirely, and decide how to best get what we need to be successful. Because while writing grants is important, we may be able to accomplish what we want without doing so. I'm going to share my experience with writing and securing dozens of grants, but not getting everything, as well as my experience reviewing grants for a variety of funders, including the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Sometimes we think we can't do something because we don't have enough money to make it happen. I get it, because as someone who's led under-resourced organizations, I've lived it. In the past decade, I've secured close to $500,000 in grants and awards to support various projects and initiatives, but I've also done a lot without additional funding. When I'm considering a new project, I make a list of the specific resources I'll need, and I ask myself why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's important to figure out why you need specific resources before searching out and applying for grants. You can find your why by considering: what need are you trying to address? What's your goal? What does success look like? And how is this going to improve the lives of people in your community? Once you've figured out your why, think about what type of resources are needed to realize your goal. We often default to money when really what we may need is expertise or access to something or somewhere. Ask if there's a way to meet your goal without additional funding. Is there a more creative solution that could involve more people in the project? If your project's about building community, your best approach is to leverage the talents and expertise of community members so that they can have the experience of co-creating the project with your library, which means you may not even need to pursue grant funding. I know that what I just said may sound counterintuitive. For decades, I've fantasized about what I could do if I had all the money I needed. I worked at and led several under-resourced small rural libraries, and it was always a challenge to fulfill my vision without proper funding. To be clear, public libraries need to be well funded and have money to try new things. Continually scrambling for resources is exhausting and leads to burnout. The struggle is real, and I don't want to minimize it. And I know spending time thinking about how to do new and different stuff without money sounds absurd, but it can be done. Sometimes it helps to reframe how we think about things, which requires us to move from a place of inaction to a place of kind of proactive creativity. The idea that we can't do this because we don't have the money we need has to shift to recognizing and understanding our limitations. Once we do that, we have an opportunity, as Ed Catmull, the author of Creativity Inc., said, to view our limitations as gifts. And to be honest, it does not always feel like a gift when we're trying to make things happen. But it makes us think creatively to make what we want to see differently, and often we end up with a better project because of overcoming those constraints. It's also important to acknowledge the abundance in all of our communities when we talk about resources. When we think about what we need to do and tie it effectively to why it matters to our communities, we find an abundance of assets in the people, places and spaces, the organizations, and institutions that comprise your community. This idea, asset-based community development, is based on appreciative inquiry. If you took part in our Engage Planning series, this is a familiar concept. It's the work we did with our community resource plans. Appreciative inquiry is a strengths-based approach that assumes we're coming from a place with abundant assets, not deficits. As we've discussed, those assets include talent, creativity, lived experience, and expertise. But too often, those talents are not fully leveraged. This is where your community resource plan comes in. If you haven't had a chance to work on one or don't know what it is, shoot me an email and I'll be happy to walk you through it. By mapping the assets in your community, you'll tap into a new set of resources that you may not have previously considered. Your community resource plan, and by the way, you develop this along with your colleagues, your trustees, your friends, and volunteers. works to identify the skills, talents, and expertise of the people in your community, as well as local institutions, the businesses that keep it going, and the spaces and places that are available for everyone to use. When I was the director of the Red Hook Public Library, I used a community resource plan to do everything from responding to issues that the community identified, to planning public programs, and creating a children's learning garden. Most of our most significant and ambitious projects didn't require an outlay of money, but relied on asking people to share their skills to create the community we wanted. In the beginning, asking people to help can be really challenging. But as you get more comfortable with it and understand that by asking people to pitch in, you're offering them an opportunity to get involved in shaping the outcome, you'll find that people are willing and often eager to contribute to what's going on. Sometimes we think people aren't interested in what we're doing, but usually it's just that no one's ever asked them for help, or they didn't realize that we needed their skills. Sometimes we feel that if we ask for help, we're revealing a weakness or making ourselves vulnerable. Either we're unable to accomplish something independently, or somehow our expertise is threatened. But when we invite others in, we expand the possibilities of what we can do and achieve while acknowledging the tremendous gifts and talents others possess. And when you start doing that, I promise you, anything can happen. But what if, after reviewing your community resource plan, despite your incredible creativity and willingness to ask for help, your project still needs money? You may need to purchase a book bike or totes to take programs to people in trailer parks, because sometimes you need money to do stuff, right? That's just reality. That's when you start thinking about applying for a grant. But before you begin, think about why. Are you doing it just to chase money? Are you trying to meet a budget goal? Are you trying to impress your board? Why is it that you're going after this money? And the best reason to write grants is to expand and improve services to your community and to help them reach their aspirations. When you make your ask, frame it as a community benefit. As my recently retired colleague Lois Gordon says, you're not asking for a bus for the library. You're asking for a bus to transport seniors after dark and children after school so that they may participate in a wealth of lifelong learning activities. So think about how your program is going to benefit the community, and be sure that the community's desired outcome has been identified not by you or your institution, but by the people affected by your proposal. Suppose we approach grant writing not as money chasers, but as organizations who want to help people live their best lives by working with our friends and neighbors. In that case, we're more likely to secure needed funds and positively impact our community. And here I want to share a story about a library in Vermont that I worked with. I worked with them to create their strategic plan. And in that process, we use the engaged planning process. And as part of that, we spent a lot of time asking people what they wanted to do. Once the planning process was complete, after we'd gathered public knowledge, identified aspirations, and done all the rest, the library was able to use what we had learned to secure grants for a really wide range of programs and activities. They were even able to hire a community coordinator position. When the library was applying for grants, the feedback they received from funders was that funders really appreciated the approach they had taken. They were looking to fund community based work. And this is a shift over the past decade, where previously funders may have been more interested in capital projects or building renovations or other things. Many funders are now looking for projects that demonstrate collaboration across silos and that are incorporating significant amounts of community input. Why? Because chances are, if you apply for a grant, a funder is going to ask you how your outcome will be sustainable, by which they mean, how are you going to keep this program going when you're no longer getting funding from us? And the only way that you can make projects sustainable is to develop capacity through collaborations that are going to continue long after the funding ends. To be sustainable, you need dedicated partners who are going to commit to working with you for your community's long term betterment. So, I want to start by looking at the traditional grant writing cycle. Grants come in a wide variety of complexities, and I'm going to focus on grants ranging from super simple to medium complexity. We're not going to be looking at federal grants because they are a whole separate beast and will require a different webinar, I think. All grant writing begins, as I mentioned earlier, with a why. What idea are we trying to make happen, and why is that important to our community? Traditional grant writing often began with trying to find a solution to a problem. The request was a priority for the institution applying for the funds, not necessarily for the wider community. Once an issue is identified, organizations search out potential funders and develop a proposal to meet the grant maker's requirements. A more effective way of looking at the proposal development, however, might not start with the idea. It might start by listening to the community and having ideas come not from your organization, but a community based solution. Instead of guessing at what people might want, we can crowdsource potential solutions from people affected by a particular issue. We can then create our ask by identifying what the community benefit would be from our proposed program or initiative and find a funder that's interested in supporting the type of work we're proposing. We can then call the funder to talk through our idea to see if what we're proposing aligns with their interests. If the answer is yes, a proposal is not far behind. By positioning our ask as part of a larger community goal, our proposal has a better chance to become an effective program. Grant writing, like everything else, is all about relationships. Think of approaching a funder as you would a first date. When you go on a first date with someone, it's all about finding out who they are and what matters to them. You don't ask them how much money they have and how much they're willing to share, right? Although, to be honest, I haven't dated in decades, so maybe things have changed and I'm missing the mark. But anyway, to be successful in grant writing, you need to build a relationship with the funder. The funder is a partner in your project. When you decide which funder you want to approach, reach out and schedule a phone call even before you have a full-fledged proposal together. This gives you time to talk through what you're planning, to get input from the funder, to help figure out how you might improve your request, and determine whether it's a good fit for them. When I started writing grants, I was really nervous about it. Some of it was imposter syndrome because I was sure everybody could tell that I'd never written a grant before. Um, and to be fair, I had no idea what I was doing, and I was too scared to call. It didn't occur to me to do so, and I didn't want to approach the grant maker before I had written and polished the whole thing because I thought I'd look like a fool. Well, sadly, I was a fool. I missed out on the opportunity to have a conversation with someone interested in the work I was doing, who could have helped me shape a grant and have a significant impact. I learned from that first experience. One of the first things I do now is call or, email, whatever works best for you, a funder to introduce myself and to give them an idea of what I'm planning. Because here's the thing, funders really want you to succeed. They are investing in you and want to be able to celebrate the work you're doing. They are committed to helping you and protecting their investment. As I mentioned before, learning to ask for help when you need it is a superpower. Begin practicing it now and use it early and often. When we think about having a relationship with funders, please remember to keep their perspective in mind when writing your grant. They want you to succeed, but they want to be a part of that success. So be sure to amplify their contribution, understand their priorities and their perspective on things, and appreciate the relationship. There is a lot of money out there. When you start looking, it's really exciting and sometimes even overwhelming to see how much money is actually available. And it's easy to begin to think of all sorts of things that you could do with the money or get distracted by opportunities that may not be super relevant to your community, but that sound really cool. So the first thing is to slow down and remember to be intentional. Think about what your community needs and what makes sense for your organization. Keep in mind, despite the seemingly endless funding out there, it's a highly competitive environment. As someone who's applied for and secured a lot of funding and who's a big fan of grant writing, and I know it can help you do amazing things, but chances are excellent that you're not going to get every grant you write, which is disappointing, but it's not the end of the world. In your early conversations, when you talk to a potential funder, ask them about their timeline. Determine if your program period matches their funding period. If the funder follows a different fiscal year than you do, it could definitely lead to problems down the road if you're not anticipating it and planning for it from the beginning. You can also ask how often they review applications and whether or not they have a definitive due date or if they use a rolling application process. As you consider writing a grant, keep in mind that the process isn't over once your request is submitted. If you receive funding, you need to implement and report on your project, all of which takes a considerable amount of time. Sometimes people think like once the grant is secured, you're golden, and I hate to disabuse you, but securing funding is actually often the easy part. What follows, the implementation and reporting, is time intensive and critical to your ongoing relationship with your funder. As someone who has relied heavily on grants, I want to give you a word of caution. Do not apply for multiple grants to be completed in the same time frame unless you can do an excellent job of fulfilling them all. You may not be able to deliver all that you have promised, which could lead to big trouble down the road. I'll talk more about this later, but I want to plant the seed now. So, where can you find grants? And there are lots of places to find grants. And again, grant writing takes time, energy, planning, and most of all, persistence. I cannot overstate this. The number one quality you need to have as a grant writer is persistence. The good news is grant writing requires research skills, which plays to our strengths as librarians. So to begin, again, you're going to want to look through your community resource plan to identify any potential partners. You're also going to want to allocate time to learn more about potential funders. As you consider funders, take a look at their 990, which is available on GuideStar, to see who they funded in the past, what projects they've invested in, and how much the awards have been in the past. Today I've mentioned funding projects, and I want to be clear. Very few funders will provide resources for operations, and many have also cut back on capital and building campaigns. Most funders are looking at broad-based projects that impact a community. And I can promise they will ask about the sustainability of your project. So be prepared to discuss how you're going to be able to continue once the designated funding is used up. A great place to begin searching for grants is the Foundation Directory. It's a really expensive database, which at SALS we have access to at the Saratoga Springs Public Library. But because it's tied to an IP address, you have to visit the library in order to use it. It's definitely worth making the time and investing a couple of hours, and you'll be amazed at the variety of funders and the ability to narrow your search by region, subject matter, profession, etc. You want to make time to research the City and County Economic Development Agency to see what projects they're funding and what issues they're prioritizing. You may be able to tap into their funding or partner with someone who's working on a similar issue. By initiating a conversation, even if it's not a funding source, they may be able to point you in the right direction. Another great resource is your county's community foundation. Community funds may even provide capacity building funds, which will provide money to do things like hire consultants to write grants, fundraise, train your board, or help you develop a volunteer coordination service. Also, talk to area social clubs like Rotary, Elks, Lions, and others, which may be interested in being involved in community based projects or have money to assist you in what you're doing. As I'm sure you've noticed, the common denominator in all these groups is to reach out and have a conversation. The more people you talk to, the better the odds of finding the right funder for your project. As you begin to apply for grants, you're going to have to provide information about your organization and your community, as well as your project. The amount of information required to secure and implement a grant depends on the funder. Before you begin the grant, read through all of the application materials very carefully. Make a checklist for yourself to ensure that you are including all of the required information. I cannot stress this enough. Funders expect you to follow the directions they have outlined. If you don't, it does not matter how compelling your narrative is or how much your community would benefit from this funding opportunity. Funders screen hundreds of applications, and they'll begin by tossing those that don't meet the basic criteria. Each section will have specific requirements, including how a funder wants things formatted, and a lot of times now word limits and sometimes even character limits. They may want to know about your expertise or what financial controls are in place. Let me pause and say that when you write a grant, channel your inner Hemingway. Funders read hundreds of applications. They give word limits for a reason. Yes, I know, our stories are compelling and we could go on for pages. Do not do that. Respect the limits set by the funder. If you don't, chances are excellent you're not going to make it through the review round. While each grant is different, there are some basic things you can expect to provide. These include a cover letter, an executive summary with an overview of the project, a problem statement or need description, a timetable outlining how and when you're going to implement the project, a budget, your qualifications, conclusions, and supporting materials, which could include things like letters of support from community organizations, statistics, or something else. The basic structure of a proposal includes a summary with background information. Here's where your community engagement efforts will really pay off. Tie your request directly to community engagement efforts. If possible, place it in the context of a broader community plan. Again, most funders are going to expect your project to be sustainable, so you need to demonstrate how you're going to continue the proposed project once the funding ends. The summary should include a description of the program that gives enough information to paint a clear picture in the reviewer's mind. They need to understand what is going to happen and why it matters. Funders want to know your why. What will be the impact or outcome of your proposed project? What behavior change or what action are you going to be taking to achieve what you've proposed? And how is the work that you're doing going to benefit the community? If a funder doesn't explicitly ask you for impacts and outcomes, include it in your narrative. It's only going to strengthen your grant application. The timeline is an opportunity to demonstrate good planning. This is where you lay out what your project is going to look like from the inception to the very end. Once you get the grant, keep the timeline in mind and check in with your funder as you move through it, whether or not they've asked you to. A funder is a partner in your project, and you don't want to have any unpleasant surprises. If for some reason you're not going to be able to meet the deadline that you established in your grant proposal, let the funder know as soon as possible so that they can work with you to find a resolution. Since funders are our partners, when we ask for money, we want to be sure that we're clearly communicating what we plan to do with the money we're asking for. And as somebody who is not great at math, I know that budgets can be tricky. So please do not be afraid to ask for help from your friends or colleagues or me who have experience with them. Take the time to demonstrate good planning and, as much as possible, tie your figures to actual quotes or salaries. Grantors want to know that you're going to be a good steward of their money. Before you submit your grant, have somebody else review your budget and check all of your figures. I've seen requests that failed to secure enough funding because of a mistake in the budget. Make time to ensure that the information you're submitting is accurate. Sometimes funders will ask that budgets include a narrative section. You can use that space to describe the costs and, again, to demonstrate really good planning. And please, when you're asking for money, be realistic about what you need and ask for what it's going to take to make the project successful. Um, and again, before submitting that final budget, please make sure that you have the same fiscal year as your funder. And if you do not, be sure to adjust your budget appropriately. Finally, be sure to get your board or director's approval before submitting the budget. You want to know that your organization approves the plan before asking for money. When you approach a funder, like I said before, you are establishing a relationship. Please do not treat the funder as a bank teller. They are humans who are investing in you, and they deserve our respect. Be able to demonstrate that you have a sincere interest in what you're proposing while balancing your passion for the work you do with professionalism. Funders are looking for projects that align with their mission. Before approaching a funder, make time to do the research. What is their focus and mission? Who have they funded in the past? What kind of projects do they invest in? Be clear from the beginning about the funder's requirements. If they state that they only fund 501c3s in Wyoming and you're a municipal library in New York, it does not matter how fabulous your proposal is, you are not going to get funded. Remember, like any successful relationship, you want to make your funder look good, have a great story to tell, and help them meet their goals. As with any relationship, communication is critical. As you're building a relationship with a granting agency, you want to ensure that you're communicating clearly. And I want to pause here and acknowledge that for many introverts like myself, there is nothing we dread more than making a phone call. Dealing with the disembodied voice of a person we don't know can be super intimidating. However, it doesn't mean that we don't have to do it. Although I suggest, if you prefer, to invite a funder to a virtual platform where you can each see each other if that makes it easier. Now that virtual meeting platforms are commonplace, it's not strange to ask somebody to meet you, face to face. So take advantage of that. But as I mentioned before, being sure to research the funder before making a call or setting up a meeting. Be able to demonstrate how your proposal supports their priorities. Adopt their language when describing your project so that you can draw parallels between their mission and your request. When you make the call, ask for questions and for advice. And here's the thing, when they give you input and feedback, listen to it and be sure to incorporate that. Or if you don't, be ready to respond with information about why you didn't. The last thing you want to do is ask for advice and then ignore it. Again, funders want to fund and they want you to be successful. So please don't be shy about asking for help and input. Reviewers are looking for proposals that have demonstrated thoughtful planning. If you're asking for funding, put in the time to think through the project. I know it's really hard when we have so much on our plates to carve out time to do one more thing. But as someone who has reviewed grant proposals, you can tell when someone's put a lot of time and effort into one and when something has been thrown together last minute. As you're writing your proposal, clarity is everything. You don't want to make people guess what it is you're trying to accomplish. Grant makers read a lot of applications. They will gravitate to the ones that are easy to understand and get to the point quickly. Your proposal should specifically state your issue, be very clear about the desired outcomes of your project, and show very easily how you're going to use the requested funds. You want to be able to clearly state how much impact a funder is going to get for their investment and somehow convince them that they need to be involved with what you're doing. Stay away from industry specific jargon, but be specific when describing the method you're going to use to attain your objectives. This is an essential element for funders who require a detailed midterm progress report. And finally, you want to identify how you're going to achieve the proposal's objectives. When you write clearly and are specific, it communicates useful information to funders and shows that your project is well planned and organized, which makes you a more attractive partner. Because funders need to know precisely what it is you're asking of them. You don't want them to have to make guesses or infer what it is you're trying to do. When you're not specific, your request may appear unorganized, unprofessional, and may cause your request to not be funded. So be sure to think about how to make the most compelling argument for funding. Would the funder respond best to a narrative, to statistics, or other numerical data? Feel free to ask them what they prefer and then comply with that wish. If you determine that there may be obstacles to your success while planning your project, don't gloss over or ignore those. Instead, mention them as in your grant and make a plan to address or mitigate the risks to demonstrate that you've thought your project through and are capable of achieving the goal you've identified. Incorporate your ask into the beginning of your proposal's overview and at least once more before the end. And please do not apologize for asking for funding. Your request should be reasonable and mutually beneficial, so there's no need to apologize. Clearly state how funding your project is going to benefit the grant maker and how it reflects their values and needs. Let them know how you're going to share their story. How are you going to let people know about their generosity? Are you going to provide publicity at your event or through the library? Are they eligible for a tax-deductible donation? Is there going to be a formal recognition, like an event celebrating the gift? Whatever you promise your audience, be sure you deliver. It is much better to underpromise and overdeliver than to not do what you said you would. Okay, hooray! You've got all the bones you need to write a terrific grant proposal. You've demonstrated a clear need. You've shown how your project will respond to that need or solve a problem that you've identified. You've echoed the funder's language. You've referenced local economic development plans to show that you're working in concert with larger community objectives. Now you want to unleash your passion and tell a really compelling story about why you're asking for support. So, to do that, you want to compile demographic information about the population you serve and show how the challenge you've identified ties to your organizational mission statement. Let them know your team has the expertise and ability to make this project happen while being specific and honest about your capacity. And while you want to share your passion, don't let it cloud your language. You want funders to know that you care deeply, but that you were able to communicate effectively. The final piece is the evaluation, which will demonstrate your project's success. In your proposal, let the funder know what success means to you and how you're planning to measure it. And there are options. Are you going to use quantitative or qualitative data or a mix of both? Are you going to use outcome-based evaluation? And also keep in mind that we have lovely free tools we can use, at least for funders in the library world. Um, in the Public Libraries Association's Project Outcome tool. As you're writing up your plans for evaluation, consider what do you want to know after the program that you didn't know before? What information does your funder want to know? How will your clients and community be better as a result of this program? And what kind of data are you going to collect? Again, is it going to be quantitative data or are you going to use anecdotes and surveys and gather more qualitative information? I want to talk a minute about what happens when things go wrong because they inevitably will. If there's anything we've learned in the past 18 months, it's that we have no idea of what's going to happen next. And even the best laid plans may be completely disrupted. So, what happens if your project isn't successful? First, take a deep breath, give it a joyful funeral, and be honest with your funder. As soon as you realize things aren't going to plan, let your funder know about it. Explain what happened, tell them what you've learned from the experience, and your plan to correct the problem. Ask your funder for advice because they're deeply invested in your success. Let them help troubleshoot and find a way forward that will work for both parties. If you're concerned about whether you'll be able to make any adjustments, ask if you're going to be eligible for future funds if you do not fulfill the grant requirements. Because remember, the funding world is small, and if you don't successfully implement a grant, it can be really difficult to find funding in the future. But the good news is, the opposite is also true. If you crush it and make the funder shine, chances are excellent when you're ready to do the next project, people are going to want to work with you. So, just again, it's all about communication and talking very clearly about what's happening. So, hooray! You secure the money you needed. You've managed to implement the grant and you've done everything you said you would do. Kudos to you. Now it's time to write up a report. And here I can just say, please take this seriously. When we take money from funders, it's our job to make them look good and demonstrate that we are a worthwhile investment. I cannot stress this enough. The grant making world is small. If you don't take it seriously and you don't treat the funder with respect by clearly communicating throughout the process, you may find it challenging to find funding in the future. As you begin to compile your results, be sure that you understand what the funder wants to know. If you made changes to the proposal after receiving funding, talk about those changes and how they affected the outcome. If you can, take time after the grant is completed to update the funders on the project's long-term impact or how it's continuing. One of the first big grants that I secured was back in 2014, and that was the American Library Association Libraries Transforming Communities grant. After completing the grant, I continued to report any presentations, workshops, or developments about the project for years. The relationship I developed with ALA's Public Programs Office continues to this day and has led to loads of other opportunities. The people I interacted with to fulfill the grant have become personal friends and have connected me to tons of other stuff. I cannot say this enough. Funders are as deeply invested in your success as you are, and they want you to do the best work you can. They will do everything they can to ensure your success if you communicate openly and honestly. So before I wrap up, I want to remind you of the basics. The devil is indeed in the details. I've had multiple opportunities to review grants for a wide range of agencies. Here are some common mistakes that I've seen that have disqualified applicants. Not answering every question, sloppiness, a lack of effort, not knowing what the grant covers, too much copying and pasting. Please don't take other applications that you've done and just copy and paste it over into a new form. You have to be sure to tailor your ask to the specific funder. Shoehorning. That's when the project clearly does not fit the grant, chances are, because you've copied and pasted from something else. Missing the deadline, you want to start early and give yourself enough time to do the research and all the work to make it a really shine. Don't be a stranger. Give them a call. Let them know you're interested in thinking about it. And being a bad partner. You have to have integrity and be appreciative of the partnership. Remember, treat your funder with respect. They are your partner in this endeavor. Be sure to comply with all requests they make and include them on all PR and advertising material. Be sure to give them a chance to review whatever you are sending out that mentions their organization. You do not want to surprise them, unless it's calling to tell them that you've overperformed. Sometimes we just can't tell what people are asking for in their grants. And clear, concise writing is key to successful grant application. So please, when you are putting together your proposal, do not use hyperbole or conversational language. Stay away from jargon or slang. And please don't use overly complex language that makes sentences really difficult to read or possibly annoying. Always keep in mind and think about, like, how can I simplify this? What is it that my funder needs to know to partner with me on this project? And how can I communicate that clearly and effectively? So, as someone who has applied for dozens of grants and secured around $500,000 in funding for various projects, I can promise you that chances are excellent you will not receive every grant you apply for. Grants are really competitive. And if you don't secure a grant you applied for, I'm not going to lie, it's a drag. You put a lot of time and effort into something and you didn't get your desired outcome. But I'm here to tell you, feel sad for a moment or two, then let it go. It is not you. There are lots of reasons why projects don't get funded. And once you find out that you haven't been funded, write or call the funder and thank them for their consideration and time. Ask them for feedback on your proposal and see if there's anything that you could have done to make it more appealing. As I mentioned before, the grant writing world is small, and you're not going to get everything you apply for. But funders want to support you and they want to support the work you're doing, and they've already invested a bunch of time in reviewing your grant. So feel free to ask them how your grant could have been more competitive or for other feedback. Once you've heard that feedback, consider if the project is still doable, if it needs to be tweaked in some way, and if it's really important to you. You can also ask the funder if others might be interested in investing in the project and if they would be willing to make an introduction to another funder or if they recommend that you reapply during another grant cycle. The important thing is to not give up and to continue to apply for funding. Again, the number one trait you need to be a successful grant writer is persistence and perseverance. So you've got this. Be brave, be bold, be persistent, and make it rain.